Greetings, Chicago, and welcome to another CANTV edition of Chicago Corner, where we cover the people, culture, and stories from across our 77 neighborhoods that make Chicago the best city in the country. Joining me this evening, or afternoon, depending on when you're watching, is our special guest, Tazima Parris, of the group Infinite Relating. And Tazima is a sex coach who specializes in sex coaching.
Yeah.
But the reason we have Tazima on, there's so much I want to learn about what you do, how it helps people. But we also had Tazima on our YouTube program not too long ago where Kira McCowan interviewed you. Yes. And what I found very, very interesting about our YouTube broadcast when you were talking with Kira is about how sexual dynamics relate to the power dynamics in politics, in government, in laws, in the relating of genders just in regular society. So, first of all, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Pleasure to meet you in person. And why don't you share with our audience a little bit about what you do as a sex coach in your business, and then we can kind of talk about how that relates to interpersonal dynamics as they affect everyday society, not just what happens in the bedroom.
That's right. In the bedroom and beyond, as I say.
Right.
So as a sex coach, my primary focus is to support women. I generally support women over 35. A few younger women sneak in every now and then, but generally 45, 50, that area and on up, even into retired women. And the reason I focus on women is because of how mainly the double standard around sexual behavior, sexual activity, the desire for sex and sexual activity, all of those things together create this dynamic between the double standard and expectations. And then there's a huge gap between the reality of a woman's biology and the desire that it's possible for her to have, and what the society expects her to be. There all kinds of political conversations happen around this, social conversations happen around this. Respectability politics can come into it as well. There are gender and racial implications of how you show up sexually, how you express your gender. And so in all of those things, what I'm helping women to find is their own space and how they can determine that for themselves. And this affects them, the woman personally, and how she relates to other people. And that's part of why my business is called Infinite Relating, is because once they establish that a better, higher quality, healthy relationship with themselves around their sexuality and how they're expressing themselves, they can take that into a relationship whether they choose to or not. They can choose what they do with that energy or that, what I call sexual agency, which is basically the choice of what you want to do with your sexual energy or your sexual capacity. I say all that to say, when we look at things like politics, or we look at dynamics, or the things that are happening right now, all the controversy around sexual expression and who you're attracted to, and the marriage and the and abortion rights and all of this stuff. If people don't feel comfortable talking about these things, and there's no education, no proper education around their sexuality or how they're relating to their own sexuality, there are going to be gaps. And what gets filled into those gaps depends on who the people are with.
Yeah.
So if their social circle is more sexually active, for example, they'll probably err on the side of more sexually active, no matter what the age of the person is. But if they're young people and being influenced, and for example, there's only abstinence-only sex education, which happens in a lot of the country, those gaps will be filled in by someone, because someone will talk to those young people about sex. And then you have the stuff that happens, all of the stuff that happens. Now, in my work, I'm helping people navigate that as adults. And so the choices are a little bit different. They have more options. And sometimes their social socialization stops them from making the choices they really want to make. And so as a sex coach, I'm helping them work through that for themselves, and then the dynamic that creates inside of relationship.
It's ironic because, as we were talking before the show, we live in such a hypersexualized society that, by the same token, seems to operate at least on hypersexualized culture with a repressed society, constantly in conflict with each other. And I find that it's very refreshing that we've finally been able to have these conversations, especially, so just for example, growing up in the 1970s, okay, I've recently been watching, well, I watched this program on the Playboy Empire, Hugh Hefner, right? What an utterly disgusting dynamic there was there. But even when I was younger, I'm like, there ain't something right with this. This is not right, but it seems like everybody's accepting this. And we're finally at a stage in society, unfortunately, because of the bad behavior of my gender. And I separate myself from that because I like to say I was raised better, that when I was younger, I sensed these things and I was taught to respect women. I've got 2 sisters. So now that we're seeing this stuff come out, and it seems like, thank goodness, we finally are able to have more open and honest conversations about this, despite the fact, as we're talking about how the power dynamic with our elected representatives, especially as it impacts women's rights, they're all for like telling women what they can do with their reproductive rights, but they can't bring themselves to say the word vagina, right? They're so repressed on that end while they're enforcing a very gender-based, judgmental, moral view on women. So, as I said, I found it really fascinating and very informative when I saw you talking with Kira about sex coaching as well as these other issues that relate to societies that affect all of us.
Absolutely.
We were talking a little bit before the show also about, I guess, the history of how sexual dynamics have been at play in society with women, with men, as it relates to marriage, which, as we look back on perhaps our families, our parents, and a different time when people didn't get divorced, it's because society would not allow women to get credit to get out of bad marriages so that they would remain in marriages to essentially serve the sexual needs of their husbands. As I look back on it, I think that there's been so much throughout our society that, despite the fact women probably thought they had rights and feminism rose up, there were still little things going on in the background to basically keep women at a level where, sadly, I think especially in relationships and how marriages were back in that time before a more aware society, that kind of stuff was going on. And do you want to touch a little bit about that history as we kind of segue into the dynamics in culture and politics right now as it affects civil rights and everything else?
So one of the concepts that I talk about that I don't hear a whole lot outside of the conversations I'm having is that we've got to go back further than just like the 50s or, early 1900s or even at the birth of this country. We've got to go back even further than that to appreciate the structure of the society that we live in now. We have a Judeo-Christian, the big 3 religions, and it doesn't matter really which one of them, or even more Eastern, Western, it doesn't matter.
They're all theocratic too.
Yeah, exactly.
Religion, faith-based.
Exactly. So if we go further back than even that, when we go to the dawn of agriculture, when you start having property, you start moving away from societies where we're hunter-gatherers, everything is pretty egalitarian because we're all out here trying to survive.
Yeah.
And there are elements and animals that are trying to kill us. So that's the baseline. Everybody does their part, and great. Also, biologically, you have 2 different brains at play here. So the hormones affect our brains in different ways. So men's brains operate in a certain way because of the hormone cocktail that bathes the brain all the time, as well as the female hormones bathing the female brain. So there are different ways that we operate based on our physical gender.
I would also say for the biological programming of procreating.
Yeah, and it makes sense because if, for example, I use this in my coaching, is if a woman neglects her needs for the needs of a baby who cannot defend themselves, that just got born and can't do things, then the baby's going to survive. If she goes, handles her needs, and doesn't handle the baby's needs, the baby will die, and end of the clan. Similarly, if a man who's hunting, and this is huge categories here. I'm not talking about specific individuals who have different ways of being, but if the person who is hunting is distracted from what they're doing or their needs, they could die, and then the meat getter is no longer bringing the meat, and so that's a problem, and the clan dies. So these different roles that kind of naturally are set up in our brains supported our survival. Now, let's move to agriculture. So you get agriculture, you get ownership of land and property, and who are the landowners as we come through?
Right.
So landowners are men,
right.
And so of their property becomes the woman, because what happens? A woman gets married, she changes her name from her father's name to her husband's name.
Takes care of the household specifically.
That's a transaction that occurs. It's literally payment. A dowry used to be paid.
Yeah.
You know, so it is a transaction to purchase a woman. So there is a level of ownership that's baked into our society that has the landowners owning not only the property, but also the women on their land, whether they're married to them or they're owning them because of slavery or indentured servitude or whatever. So if our entire society is based on that framework, we cannot be surprised when rules are being made about women's bodies, because it's about the productivity of the property.
I think the fact that you focus on that word property is very, very insightful, because, you know, I don't know how many people have really been able to logically put it together this way, and what you're sharing is not something that I haven't actually considered myself as I've kind of gotten older and reflected back on the way I see society working, especially the power dynamics between men and women, and how, sadly, women have been abused. We have men in power who have abused their positions. That kind of fits that whole role of like, well, we're the owners, we're the property, we're the ones making the decisions, and you're less than equal.
And so among my friends, we joke and also not joking, that the system is not broken. The system is working the way that it was designed. So if you think about women being property, then it makes sense that people who are lawmakers and landowners would make rules about how their property is treated and how the property can operate.
And clearly, a lot of our elected representatives are octogenarians who don't have the enlightened viewpoint that younger people, generations like ours. It's true. I mean, we look at all, on both sides. We're not. This is not about being partisan. We look at all of our elected representatives. 80s, 90s. They come from a culture that looked past it, didn't understand it, and can't quite change their mindset into understanding how imbalanced and, forgive my language, fucked up it is.
Yeah. Oh, and so, bringing this to the sexual realm, one of the things that I bring out is that if we were, so I say some controversial things and I'm fine with that. One of the controversial things that I say is that we're not naturally monogamous as humans. We go back to the hunter-gatherer situation. If no one was owning anybody, it didn't matter. Paternity didn't matter. And there are some traditional cultures, indigenous cultures, who don't think that there's one father of a child. All the children belong to the entire community. And that's the way that it is. So co-parenting happens among the entire clan. In our isolated spaces, paternity mattered because property would be passed down through the patrilineal line. So virginity became so important to make sure that you're not passing on this land or property onto someone who is not your actual bloodline. So again, the system is not broken. It's working as it's designed.
That way. Yeah.
And so if you're making a bunch of rules about marriage, it means that marriage, you don't have to legislate things that are natural. No one has to legislate breathing. We're all going to breathe from our first day to our last. And that's that. But we have to legislate things like marriage because it's not necessarily a natural thing. And I'm not suggesting that everyone should be non-monogamous, okay, because that's a choice. What I am saying, though, instead, is that similarly, our sexuality is regulated because it's deeply powerful. I'm going to get a little esoteric for a moment, but if you think about our sexual energy, it makes new people. That's a powerful energy. It's a powerful possibility. And with women being the ones who hold the baby, can literally bring a new life from non-physical, from the spirit realm into the physical realm. That's a positive space. You said earlier, people can't say vagina. What we see on the outside is actually not even the vagina. The vagina is just the hallway that the baby comes down into the world. What we actually see on the other outside is vulva, but we say penis all the time. We can say penis all day. Yep. But the fact that women themselves don't even know the word vulva to distinguish the difference between the vulva, the outside part of the genitals, and the inside of the genitals, where a man would put his penis, or a person with a penis would put their penis for their pleasure, if that's the way that they choose to have sexual pleasure. The point being, if we're looking at, one, you don't have the vocabulary to talk about your needs or your pleasure or your pain or medical challenges. If you're being suppressed in this powerful energy that you have living inside of your body and you don't even know about it, if you're being held as property and you're not even thinking about it in a critical way of like, what are my choices? What do I want? What do I need? Because you're defaulting to a certain way of being, then women are not just suppressed, but we're misinformed. And we're holding ourselves in a way where we're not as powerful as we could be.
I think also the legal construct, as you talk about with marriage,
yes.
right, is a property transaction.
Yeah.
I mean, my views on marriage have changed so much as I've gotten older. I personally, my viewpoint now, because of that dynamic we're also talking about, I feel that, like, unfortunately, so many people of both genders are so reckless about marriage. I don't even really think that it's a necessary institution aside from the idea of creating a foundation to raise a family and raise children within. I mean, that's just my personal view. Because of the whole transactional nature of marriage is like a legal construct, that sometimes people who are not as emotionally or invested or committed to what the other partner might see it as can just decide to discard it, right? So I find that that's very fascinating also, if you apply that to the whole concept of like, yeah, this is a property transaction and it's meant to kind of keep women in a place. And as our society has changed and cost of living has changed and women have been forced into the workforce, it kind of did impact that model and that dynamic, as I would say, at least from my own memory, growing up, my mother ended up going back into the workforce, I think in the 80s. It was a different time before that where women could stay home and probably were fine with that until they realized some women could stay home. Yeah. Thank you for correcting me. But I think that just the nature of our society and the cost of living and the economy changing, that it forced women into the workplace. A lot wanted to go into the workplace. It provided opportunities for them, which they should have. That sadly, a lot of men are kind of they are intimidated or threatened by that.
Yeah, and a lot of what you're sharing is this space of you can't hold property as an equal if you hold it as property.
Right.
And even though we may not talk about it in these terms, the posture is there. The consistent reinforcement, a man and his castle, his kingdom, and these are his subjects and his family. He's providing for his family. And there's nothing wrong with those things. Yeah. It just sets up a way of thinking in our minds, a mental posture that holds all these people are mine.
Yeah. Well, I think within the confines, again, of like, and maybe that's the wrong word to use, confines. It seems very restrictive. But I think within the foundation of providing a home and a nurturing environment for children to raise children. Yeah. That's where that construct makes the most sense.
And similar to the lack of information that people have around specifically physical sexuality and having sex and how to have pleasure and all of these things and how to relate to your own sexual energy, we also don't have any place in our society where people are actually teaching people how to relate in a conscious, intentional way.
productive and guilt-free or shame-free.
We're following a really old pattern that was passed down to us by whoever we saw. So whatever our family was doing, that's the way you do it. You just recreate that. And there are a lot of therapists and coaches who make their living based on the default settings that people have for their relationships.
Helping to break the cycle, helping people recognize that there's a cycle that they're involved in that is not productive, and it's not mentally or emotionally healthy. And once you can point out these things that a lot of people, if they've grown up in a particular household or where it was just normal, it's like, well, here's an objective other way of looking at it, so you can understand maybe some of this is not healthy, and it'll help you feel better, relate better between men and women, both sides.
So children from 0 to 7 are in what's called a hypnagogic state, where everything that comes in is normal, whatever that is, whether it's happy-go-lucky, hey, we're having a good time, mom and dad are here, everything's good, I have a sibling maybe, maybe 2, everything's fine. Or abuse, and, there's one parent gone or often, and maybe they're on their own trying to figure everything out. That's also normal. So without us consciously getting support for whatever it is, and by the way, those 2-parent homes also have plenty of dynamics that can screw people up as well. And so in that framework of what people are taking in, we're only recreating it unless we get support and help to change that. And
people coming out of those environments are just perpetuating a dysfunction that they don't even realize that they're engaged in.
Intergenerational trauma. Intergenerational behaviors that the cycle can't be broken, or people are having trouble with it. And that's the kind of stuff that also informs our legal framework. And people showing up, how they're showing up in relationship or abuse or...
I would also... I truly believe this is also what impacts the abuse of relationships. This is why so many people are in abusive relationships. They're either with partners or they are people that don't understand that they're in this cycle of dysfunction.
It feels normal.
Exactly.
It feels normal.
Yeah. So your work, sex coaching, especially with women, helps provide some insight and kind of, I guess, unwraps what's going on from a broader perspective so that women can look at it differently. And I hope men watching will also consider this stuff, because I would hope and imagine that there are also some sex coaches for men. I mean, I think men and women both can definitely use an objective perspective from therapists, coaches who have got a broader sense of the landscape and helping identify dysfunction that they have not been able to recognize throughout their lives.
It's really helpful to get someone who has more information than a stressed out grade school or middle school teacher or high school teacher who was trying to squeeze it in and get information in between the information that they were getting from their friends and maybe family, perhaps.
Well, this also speaks to the fact that wouldn't it be nice if we had a healthier perspective on teaching proper sex education in schools? I don't necessarily know that personally, I feel that it should start like when a kid's brain is a little bit more fully formed, when they're 10, 11, maybe a little bit beyond that. But the fact that there's even resistance to children learning about sex in school, being educated, understanding more about contraception because of the repressive nature of abstinence. Look, kids are going to engage in sex. They're attracted to each other. Now, you can teach them to do it responsibly, and you can teach them to respect the other gender, or, you can continue this very repressive environment that unfortunately I feel leads to this dysfunction between genders, as we've seen generation to generation because of that model that you started with historically that's brought us forward.
And what's beautiful, though, is that there are comprehensive sex education programs. And what we've seen is that, and there are studies, if people want numbers on them, I can't remember all the numbers, but if people want it, there are studies about this. But one of the ones that I do remember is that in abstinence-only sex education, you have way higher rates of STIs and unwanted pregnancies. In comprehensive, you have 6 times less unwanted and teenage pregnancies, and the young people were something like 40% more likely to use protection on their first time having sex, and better communication. And also, it also closed the gender gap between pleasure and orgasm, with 90% of young people reporting that they found that the sexual activity that they engaged in appropriately for their age or whatever was pleasurable to them. Whereas it's way huge. The orgasm gap, look it up if you want to, but it's depressing.
Well, it has to do a lot too with the fact that unfortunately this guilt and sex and shame that's related to all of this, it comes from a theocratic perspective instead of like a healthier secular one. Yeah. Listen, as we're coming to the end of our show, share your website with us so that our audience can find you. We'll also put the lower third up there for you.
Sure, absolutely. So my website is infiniterelating.com. On that website, you can find some information on how to get in contact with me. Also, Instagram is a great place because I have a whole lot of goodies. And on Instagram, it is Tazima Parris, Instagram, and / at Tazima Parris.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us. This is going to be our last broadcast from this set. We will be back soon on a new set with more episodes on CANTV. Thank you for joining us. Please follow us on YouTube. Watch our show there. Chicago Corner. Tazima, thank you for joining us. And remember, if it's happening on the streets, you'll hear about it here on Chicago Corner. Thank you for tuning in, and we look forward to seeing you on our next broadcast.
The views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views or positions of any entities they represent. If you would like to be a guest on Chicago Corner, please email our host, Jerry, at chicagocorner.tv.